Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual Talks at Google event. My name is Stephanie LeBlanc, and I'm the Global Head of Inclusion for Women of Color here at Google. I want to welcome educator and award-winning author, Dr. Jennifer Harvey, to discuss her most recent New York Times bestselling book, Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America. If you have questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Harvey while we're talking, please use the YouTube live chat. A little bit more about Dr. Harvey. For 20 plus years, she's been active in multiracial organizing for racial justice, specifically focusing on white anti-racism. She brings this experience to the parenting journey in her book, Raising White Kids. And Dr. Harvey also serves as professor at Drake University and currently lives in Des Moines, Iowa, with her generous partner, her hilarious children, and two very large and very beautiful dogs. Welcome, Dr. Harvey. How are you?
I'm good, Stephanie. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for being here. So before we dig in, I think there are two important call outs for this conversation. One, this conversation is not only for parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, but it's literally for anyone that has been in the same physical space as a child. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. Anyone who's seen a child or been seen by a child is helping to raise that child.
And then the second call-in is this cross-racial conversation amongst parents that you and I are having. So you have two children. I'm the mom of three. And I think we all wonder what conversations are happening in each other's homes. Mm-hmm. So I think this will really resonate with the audience, give a peek behind the scenes, and really open up a discussion that people can have within their own communities, within their own households, within their own friendship circles.
Agreed. Yes.
So let's start about your background, right? So in your book, you talk about this term white silence and how pervasive a norm it was in the way that you and many white people grew up. So tell me, how did you grow up in a background like that and then write a book about anti-racism? What caused the shift from silence to focusing your life on anti-racist teaching?
Yeah, so I would say the shift happened first around my own whiteness and then later around being a mom. I was raised in Denver public schools when we were under a desegregation mandate. And so I was bused through my early elementary years, which means at school, though not in my neighborhood, most of my first friends were Black, mostly Black girls. And in fact, because of white flight, I was a racial minority demographically in those schools. But what I noticed as I got older was that though I was in a multiracial high school, my classes got whiter and whiter because now I know we were being racially tracked. At the time, I didn't understand that. I just wondered where all my friends had gone. So no one talked about that with me. Alongside that, I was raised in a very committed Christian evangelical family. So my deepest teaching in life was God is love, God is love, God is love. And that's how I thought about the world. And at some point in college, I started to recognize that through some teaching that I was exposed to within Christianity, that, if God is love, then actually God also has to be a God of justice because injustice harms people. And so in my college years, I made my way and found my way into the work of James Cone, who created Black liberation theology. And Dr. Cone said, yes, God is a God of love. And if God is a God of love, God is a God of justice. And if God is a God of justice, then we need to read the gospel through the lives of African-American communities because African-American communities experience injustice in profound ways. In fact, Cone said, God is Black, Jesus is Black. So this shook my world in profound ways. And actually, most importantly, what Dr. Cone gave me was an understanding of what had happened to me in my school system. I thought, oh, that was white supremacy that I was wrestling with as a high schooler. So I went to seminary to study this theology, Black liberation theology, and be in the community Dr. Cone was in. And I show up as this white woman in New York City in a community of many African-American men and women, Latino men and women, saying things like, God is a God of justice, God is Black. And they basically said to me in my early 20s, good for you, white girl. Like, have you looked at yourself? Like, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that community gave me a call and a challenge around my own. What does it mean to be white and to care passionately about racial justice? And so I just started on that journey. And but then when I had kids, I would find myself in spaces with lots of white folks wrestling with white anti-racist commitment. And after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, in spaces where folks were saying to me, yeah, okay, we are trying to work towards this commitment as white folks to racial justice, but how do we talk about these issues with our children? And my kids were about 3 and 5 at the time. And I thought, how am I talking about it with my children? Like, by then I'd been doing anti-racist work in various ways for a very long time. And I realized I wasn't even sure what I was doing with my own kids. And I thought I better get some intentional reflection going with this. As it turns out, I was doing things with my kids, but I hadn't thought about it. And I realized there were very few resources for those of us committed to this work in terms of how we needed to be parenting. And so that's what led into the particular parenting book that showed up as Raising White Kids.
So that's interesting that you shared in your sort of professional life that you steeped yourself in Black liberation theology, yet still when you became a parent, it was still, how do I talk to my kids about this? So for the typical white parent, white person with children in their life, what's the work that they need to do before they even broach the topic with their kids, right? Because I think we all have this like idealistic way of like, we need to, know all the things and be an subject matter expert before we talk to our kids about a certain topic. Because God forbid we say we don't know when they ask us a question. But
Right.
What are your thoughts on this about the preparedness that white parents need to have to talk about race in their household?
Yeah, that question's so urgent because one of the things that I think white adults need to understand, whether we have children that we're primarily responsible for or not, is the reasons that we get stuck about race and racism and anti-racism, most importantly, is because in the generational work of bringing up children, white adults today, folks in my age set, we have not had the mentoring by grandparents and parents and aunts and uncles into anti-racism and explicit teaching about race that wasn't inflected with racism, of course, that many times has happened in communities of color, where African-American grandparents and caregivers and aunties will actively, for the sake of their children's survival, teach them what race means in their lives. So white adults, we really haven't had that in an anti-racist committed way. So for those of us parenting, we get frozen in this idea that, oh my gosh, not only do I not know what to say to my kid, part of that is because I actually don't know what to say to myself. And so we need to do a couple of things. One, we need to understand that's why we're so stuck in many cases. Not so we can stay stuck, though. It's so that we can begin to actively choose to learn. And with our children, we need to recognize that our kids, if we engage them, even if we don't have the right answers, in most situations, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to keep revisiting and revisiting. So I need to start reading. I need to start reading what Black mothers are saying they need white children to know in order to be a good friend to their children, right? And I need to start reflecting my own journey with race. But I also can start right away talking with my children, how whatever their age is, around difference and diversity, if they're really young, just starting to notice difference with them. If they ask questions, encouraging the questions and saying, I actually don't know how to answer that. Let me think about this a little bit, and then go do some Googling, right? And start to engage them, even if we don't think we have the right answers yet. Because the reality is our kids, usually we can revisit and revisit and revisit. We don't have to be perfect. And in fact, I like to remind myself that one of the things white folks need in conversations about race is more humility. And it's actually good for me to model to my children, H, I didn't feel great about how I answered that question or how I talked about that with you yesterday, but I went and did some more learning about it. And I'm wondering if we can talk again about how we understand Rosa Parks. So we just need to be willing to speak. Silence isn't better than speaking, but we don't have to have all the answers. We just have to insist that there's a conversation worth happening with our kids.
I think one of the de facto sort of conversations that then get had with kids is around color blindness. Everyone's equal. We love diversity. Everyone's the same. We just treat them with love. And you had said in a previous talk, speaking on the civil rights movement, that there was this gross misreading of Dr. King's statement: "Judge me by the content of my character and not the color of my skin." And it has since bred this notion that being colorblind is a good thing, a neutral thing from being racist. Please share what your thoughts on the impact of focusing on humanity without color, what colorblindness is, and then the harm and damage it does to our society.
Yeah. So I want us to notice that Dr. King said, "Judge me by the content of my character, not by the color of my skin." That's what he said, right? He didn't say don't notice or value the difference and gift of beautiful diversity that I bring into the world, right? So it's just that base level, it's such a misreading of what he was talking about. But color blindness, the way it plays out in white families, there's a number of problems that it causes. At best, it literally distorts our ability to talk with the children about what they are actually seeing and experiencing. Because unless our children have visual impairments, it is not a thing that kids do not see color. They do see color. And in fact, we have study after study after study that has shown unequivocally that by the ages of 3 and 4 and 5, kids not only notice difference, they also start to breathe in what's going on in the racist climates that we're all living in the United States, and internalize negative perceptions about kids of color, if they're white children, and false notions of their own superiority, right? And parents won't know this is going on if we start just always saying to our kids, we're colorblind, right? And then by the age of 4 and 5, kids know in pretty sophisticated ways what racial difference means in society and how it plays out in the world. And so this has been studied massively. And the problem with colorblindness is when we're telling our children to be colorblind, we're literally saying to them, we don't see that thing that you actually are seeing. And thus our children learn very early that they can't talk about it with us. So what they do is they draw conclusions about what they see in the world without our assistance. And in a segregated nation that is also a white racial hierarchy, that's catastrophic. So for example, my children go to the doctor or go to school or go out in our neighborhood. And if they don't see African-American teachers, if they don't see Latino, Latina, Latinx doctors, and I'm not talking with them about why that might be in a racially unjust society, then they go, oh, well, I guess those kind of folks aren't doctors, aren't teachers, right? And they draw their own racist conclusions. So that's like at best. And then more directly, colorblindness and, teaching our kids we're all equal is really a version of colorblindness because we have to be more specific than that. At worst, what it also does is tell our kids, hey, there's something wrong with the fact that that person over there has darker skin, right? Because we're not usually saying, don't notice that white skin. We're usually saying, oh, yeah, that person is black. Don't notice that. They go, oh, yeah, there's something wrong with being black, right? And they internalize a negative perception about blackness while also ignoring the reality that communities of color have said over and over again to white Americans, my difference matters to me. I want it to be seen. It's not a compliment to not see who I am. And so it's also actually a direct refusal to acknowledge what Black and brown communities have been saying to us over and over, which is, I want to be seen as Black because I am Black and I'm proud of that. So it's not a compliment to say, don't see it. So it's got many, many layers that create real problems for our children.
Okay, so I want to go in like 3 different directions.
Okay.
Based on what you just shared. But let's go with this divergence of relationships based on the education that happens at home, right? So for instance, for me, with my eldest, who's now 10, when she was 4, she came home from school and told me, Mom, you know what? I'm so glad I'm white. And I said, excuse me?
Wow.
I'm so glad I'm white, and I'm so thankful for Dr. King, because now I get to play with Black kids and like my Black cousins. And that was that moment. And the story reminded me of what you shared about that silence and then kids drawing their own conclusions.
Yeah.
I had these assumptions that she knew who she was, that we lived in our Blackness proudly and intentionally. But clearly the conversation and what she was seeing and hearing wasn't direct enough for her age group, right? And so from that moment on, it's like, okay, how do you expose your kids to diversity, to understanding who they are, who others are? But then not everyone else is on that journey, right? So we see these warm and fuzzy stories of relationships between white kids and children of color. But then at some point, these cross-racial relationships, as the kids get older, kind of separate based on the level of education of race and racism that each child has.
Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts on how to address that schoolhouse chatter that can happen, and that you come home and kind of hear some things that the kids heard either at school or have heard on the news or regardless? How can you address that to get everyone on the same level so that when they get to 12 and 13, they're not then looking at each other at odds because they don't understand each other anymore?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a really big, challenging journey that our kids go through. And of course, those warm and fuzzy stories you're talking about, usually those stories are about younger kids, right? We don't see them that often about teenagers. Mm-hmm. And the story I like to share is to think about, so my eldest is, both of my children are white. My eldest is 11. I have a nephew who's Black. He's about 13. They've been really, really good friends their entire lives. We live in the same city. We're kind of collectively raising them together, my sister and sister-in-law and I and my partner. And they can be great friends right now. And I like to remind folks, like, I know that if I only ever teach my child, if I only ever say to her, look, police are safe, go find one, and if you ever get in trouble. But her cousin, who is necessarily being taught that police are complicated for him, right? He's necessarily being given the talk that more white Americans are now aware that Black families have with their children, or the young people that they're bringing up. If I, like, they can cousin love each other all they want at this point. As they age, the depth of and the authenticity of their friendship will erode, because my white daughter will literally not be able to identify with her cousin, not maybe even believe him when he shares his experiences with her in the world. And she definitely won't be able to stand alongside him or behind him when he needs solidarity from her, right? And so that's just a great example of part of me raising a white child to be anti-racist committed and able to sustain interracial relationships means I have to give her a parallel version of the talk. It's not the same talk he's getting because she's not at risk the same way he is, right? She needs to understand what her whiteness means in the world. She needs to understand that she has decisions she can make about how to be in solidarity. And again, I didn't get that mentoring of how to do that from the elders who raised me, but I'm needing to learn right now how to have those conversations with her in support of that friendship. And the more we do that with more of our children collectively, the better our kids will be able in middle school and high school, I hope, to sustain those relationships. But it's some heavy lifting. We have some work to do, because if white parents are honest, most of us actually haven't broken out of our own white bubbles in terms of actual, authentic, sustained interracial relationships. And so in some ways, we're asking our kids to do things we have not even figured out how to do ourselves. And so part of it is equipping white children and youth to be really able when it comes to race, to diversity, and to anti-racism, because then they can sustain those friendships. But it doesn't just happen by osmosis or accident, because the forces in our society work against that.
So you talked about, kids being able to kind of see that, right, from their parents. And I think, in conversations that I've had to prepare for this, there's also this sense of fear from white parents around talking about their race as being white against the backdrop of almost connecting it with being racist, right? That fear of talking about who they are because of the connection it has to Black and Brown communities, and how the whole diversity and inclusion and race and anti-racism conversations are happening. So what sort of advice can you give white parents as being able to give the truth of where the society is and still creating a sense of self and confidence for their children as well? Because I think that's the same struggle that Black and Brown parents have to create that sense of, you are amazing, you are smart, you are all of these things in spite of what we see there. And so how do those conversations look on the flip side for white families?
That question is brilliant, because you've named the precise conundrum, right? Because whereas you describe, families of color needing to say to their kids and the young people in their lives, you are brilliant, you are beautiful, you are amazing, in order to ensure they're thriving in the wake of, white racism, essentially. Adults of white kids, parents of white kids, we have this challenge. It doesn't play the same. We need to not be telling our kids, you're amazing, you're wonderful, in a racial key, right? Because they already have those sort of society reflective false notions of white superiority flashing back at them all the time. So this is a really important question that gets at the reality that white adults are also ourselves having to learn and work through some of the same developmental processes that we need to help our kids through. So that, for example, in my 20s, I wallowed in white guilt, right? White guilt is a developmentally normal, predictable white response when we start to realize we're white, we believe in equality and equity, and we're benefiting all the time from injustice. One of the developmental antidotes to guilt is to move into action and to learn to act with others, to learn that our whiteness does not have to be the determining factor in terms of our ability to commit to racial justice, right? So as a parent, part of my work, I think, is to support my kids in getting through and being partnered with the sort of guilt stuff that comes up when you realize you've inherited these legacies. I didn't cause the legacy of white racism in this nation, but I did inherit benefits that come with it, whether I wanted to or not. And so my journey as a parent is to walk with my children as they contend with those very painful truths, but not leave them there, to then also walk with them and show them that you can choose anti-racist commitment in response to those legacies and how they shape all of our lives. And that white guilt is it's not the point. The point isn't to feel bad. The point is to choose to journey with others to create a world of justice for all of us. And the reason that is so important for white parents to understand is that what you're talking about right now, how this can manifest for kids, when we don't talk about and admit and acknowledge the real challenge of white identity and how it does raise feelings of guilt or confusion or whatever, if we're trying to be committed to equality, but we're also benefiting from injustice, what happens, we know, is that in the teenage years, our children become very vulnerable to forces in this country that would like to prey on white guilt with young kids and youth and turn it to their own ends. Mm-hmm. So I want white teenagers to know that when they go into a school and they're being told that diversity is a value, that we value diversity, and then they're like, okay, but I don't get to value my whiteness. What do I do with that? I want them to know that there are white anti-racist committed humans that would love to journey with them through that challenge so that they're less likely to go, this whole diversity thing, I don't get any of it. So I'm actually going to go embrace my whiteness, and I'm going to embrace it in ways that anyone on this call, right, is explicitly going, oh my gosh, we need to stop this, mm-hmm. right? And so this is another reason that whether we feel equipped in this moment or not, adults who have white children in our lives have to start talking with them about the real challenges that being white creates when you start to contend with the legacies that we all as white Americans have inherited, because otherwise that guilt or that, guilt gets sublimated and it ends up turning into anger that gets directed at people of color very easily. And that right now in this nation is a crisis.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for naming that piece, right? How youth can internalize what they see. And if there isn't a positive place for them to process that, then they are prey for other individuals, organizations, ideologies that can continue the divide and the crisis that we are seeing.
Yeah.
So you talk about talking the talk, right, for parents, but what does walking the walk look like, right? We talk about, we want diversity. We want to have, our friends to be diverse, our dinner table to be diverse, our neighborhoods, right? The schools that our kids go to, maybe we talk about it, but are we actually walking that? So how can we desegregate our lives so that it's not just performative around talking about wanting diversity or saying that we are diverse because we live in certain diverse neighborhoods, but that are having really harmful impact for the Black and Brown communities that were originally there, for instance, right? That it's performative and that it looks diverse on the surface. But if you actually had a conversation with like a parent and a kid about how diverse their life really is, that can really, really tell the truth about what's going on and what we actually put into action versus what we say.
Yeah. So I think that one of the first things we need to do, white Americans, is really acknowledge that anytime we say, and me too, anytime I say, because this is still true in my life, there's, of course, for all of us who are in white America, how do I do this? This organization or this neighborhood it's mostly white people. So how do I even learn to do any of this? We need to acknowledge that the forces of segregation in this nation are deep and thick and ancient.
Systemic. Yeah.
Systemic. No organization or neighborhood or school system shows up predominantly white by accident. It all has a history sitting right there underneath it that is, also today, right? When we acknowledge that, I think that can be helpful to then say, okay, whether I'm in a diverse school system or neighborhood or a predominantly white one, I need to pick my head up, look around, and say, where in my local community are Black and Brown communities saying racial harm is happening here, racial redress is needed here, this policy is hurting Black families, is impacting Latinx, Latino, and Latina communities. Even in predominantly white spaces, we don't have to look very far to find Black and Brown leaders saying those kinds of things and actually organizing against those kinds of things. So one of the most important high level of integrity things we can do as white Americans is in our own local communities, literally show up and get involved in support of the work that Black and Brown people are doing all over the country. And performativity is always a risk. It just is. And so we need to go in those spaces if we're welcome there. In many, many spaces we are, if we show up and sort of, reflect humility and a willingness to learn and don't sort of take over, right? But we say to ourselves, this is not going to be a one-off. I'm going to go to this civic organization, or I'm going to partner with this church, or whatever the group is, right? And no matter what happens, even if I'm a little uncomfortable at first, even if I feel like I'm outside my sort of normal wheelhouse, I'm going to stay. I'm going to say, I'm committing to this community or this space for a significant period of time. Because over time, what will happen if we do that is we will, if we're in that space, learn new things, develop some new relationships. Our thinking will get changed. And pretty soon we'll start to know, oh, when Jen Harvey, moved to Des Moines, Iowa from Brooklyn, New York, which was a very big change in my life, and everyone said to me, oh, this space is white, so white, and this space is so white because Iowa's so white. Well, within a couple of years, I was like, wait a second, Iowa is not so white. Yes, the state is very white, but Des Moines is very diverse. It's just really segregated. And so the more I learned to choose desegregation, the more I discovered, oh, there's tons of things happening among communities of color in Des Moines, Iowa. And many of the places that white folks live are like that. Segregation literally makes us not even know who's in our own community. And so choosing to find Black and Brown led organizations and spaces, if we are welcome there, and deciding I'm going to participate and I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay in it. And I'm going to take my kids along. And then pretty soon our experience of what even our local community is might start to change. And more importantly, we're resourcing and supporting the leadership and justice work that's going on all over the country all the time.
Love that. So just want to remind the audience that you can put your questions into the YouTube live chat, and we'll do 2 more questions and then get to the audience questions. So my next one kind of piggybacks off of what you shared, right? Do the work, put yourself out there, right? Go beyond performative and enter diverse circles, bring your children along with you. But then there's also this fear of, I'm going to go do this thing. And I think like, I did it. We had lunch with these folks, or we volunteered here. Right. Then you receive feedback that it's totally off base. So foot and mouth, you're ashamed, embarrassed. And then you're like, you know what? Too much. I'm not even going to do this ever again. Talk about the resiliency and the level of commitment and the fact that, you know, you will never get it perfect every time, or even any of the time, but the importance of still going forth and doing this work in spite of that fear of embarrassment, shame around that.
Yeah. So I like to think about and talk a little bit these days about, if I decided I was going to run a marathon and that was really important to me, I would never start out that journey and think, well, next week I'm running a marathon and I'm just going to be great at it. I would go, oh, actually, maybe today I need to see if I can run around the block, right? And then tomorrow I'm going to run around the block twice. And lo and behold, if I build and commit every day to that running around the block and then twice and then 3 times, over time, I developed the capacity to run a marathon. The language of white fragility, or the resilience that white folks often do not have when it comes to race and racism and anti-racism, in part is because we just haven't done it. And so one of the things I like to tell other white folks is something I've experienced, which is literally that the more we do it, the more resiliency we develop. Having said that, it can be very helpful to know that shame and guilt and embarrassment when we make mistakes, again, are developmentally normal experiences. And the reason it can be good to know that is because those things are going to happen. I have had more than one day that I did or said something that the next day I thought, I do not want to get out of bed and go face this community again where I did this thing. Mm-hmm. And I also have had more than one experience where I learned that showing up again anyway, apologizing, taking responsibility, and saying, I want to learn to do better, actually, it worked. And I found out that I didn't die after making a horrible mistake, right? I found out that sometimes forgiveness is possible, but only if I'm really open to acknowledging it and learning to do better. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't come, and then I still didn't die, right? But I continued on the journey and developed more resiliency. And so I totally appreciate, because it's me sometimes, why being called out or saying something in public that then, a colleague of color who I respect says, wow, that wasn't that okay, right? Or that looked a little performative or whatever. It doesn't feel very good. But it's also true that, like, when I touch into this place where I realize my commitment to this work is not about how I'm perceived, my commitment to this work actually needs to be about the well-being of Black and brown people. And when I'm focused on that, then when I get it wrong and I get called out, it actually hurts a little less because I go, oh, thank you. Thank you for helping me do a better job of journeying into the kind of person I want to be, that I'll be working on being for the rest of my life. So, I mean, for me, the biggest thing around resiliency is literally coming to know that when we try and continue to take the next step and take the next step, resiliency comes. We make less catastrophic mistakes. We will always make mistakes, but less harmful mistakes. We get better at it. And we actually do a really important thing for our kids. Again, white people modeling humility is rare, and it's really important. And when my kids see me acknowledge a mistake and show up again, despite having, caused some harm and having to really account for that, then they go, oh, I'm not going to run away from situations where I don't know what to do. I'm going to do my best and then be opening to listening and learning and doing better. And as we do that, we actually get more and more in touch with our own freedom and liberation. And that's the other piece of this, is like profound joy that comes from really having an experience of a journey of freedom and liberation that complicity with whiteness and white supremacy will never give white US Americans.
Wow. Love that. Love that. So one more question before we get to audience questions. So we talked about colorblindness. We talked about white silence. Now let's explicitly talk about anti-racism. And I feel like people kind of clutch their pearls when they hear this term, because it seems so powerful and just insurmountable, right? Versus saying, I'm not racist.
Yeah.
Right? And Ibrahim Kendi says, look, you're either racist or you're an anti-racist. Like there's no sort of in between. And so as this term comes up a lot, what does being anti-racist and raising anti-racist children mean to you? And how is it different from how it's been talked about in the media or at large in the past, which is watered down? If you ask me, yes. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. So one of the things I love about what Ibram Kendi has offered us is also this recognition that we're either being racist or anti-racist. And he actually also says, most of us are both at the same time, depending on what we're doing, right? And I find that profoundly helpful because anti-racism is not a noun. Like, I am not an anti-racist because it's not a state of being, right? Anti-racism is behavior, it's choices, it's actions. And sometimes speaking is an action. But it's not a state one ever arrives at. It's not a noun. And so like in my family, what I think about with my own children, what I'm trying to cultivate in them is anti-racist commitment. I'm trying to teach them we're an anti-racist committed family, just like we're a family committed to, trying to do better in terms of care of the earth, just like we're a family committed to kindness, like we're an anti-racist committed family. And so it's more journey as opposed to a fixed point. But the other thing that Kendi is talking about, and Ijoma Oluo has talked about this, is that talking about anti-racism is important because it also shows there's not a non-racist space. Like sometimes white folks, we like to go, okay, I'm not racist. Like I'm neutral, right? I'm going to sit back in this moment. And the reality is that racism is smog in the air. It's smog in the air. And that is Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's metaphor. And Dr. Tatum has taught us, like, it's literally, we're breathing it in all the time. We're living in racist structures, all of us, not just white folks, all of us, right? And so we are constantly either acting in compliance with those unjust structures or choosing against them. I am either allowing this verbal racism that's being expressed by a family member to go unaddressed, or I am choosing against it by speaking into it and against it and addressing it. There's no non-racist space. There's no neutral space because racism is just so pervasive. And so we have, diversity and like non-racism, I think has been, is sort of, prevalent in how we've talked about race for a very long time. But I think, lots of leading thinkers are helping us get more and more clear that when you're living in racism, all of us are, whether we choose it or not, there's no neutral position. And so that's helpful to me because I'm in a faculty meeting or I'm at a PTA meeting and I can say to myself, in what ways in this space is racism being reproduced? And in what ways are folks working against reproducing racism? And how can I be part of that work? It's a behavior. And so we don't get to sit back and be neutral. There's not a neutral position when racism is the norm, which unfortunately in the United States, it is in all of our institutions and organizations.
Love that. Thank you so much, Jen, for answering my questions. And now we are going to turn it over to the audience. So our first question comes from Leslie Green, and she says, can you talk a little bit about how to approach these conversations with children with mixed heritage, where they have intersectional identities, and how to teach them to embrace both sides?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And so I'm going to suggest two things. One is that I do think, especially for kids whose mixed heritage means there's also families that have, especially if, part of the family is white family, that experience with whiteness, thinking about the specific ways that white socialization probably has impacted even the parent or the grandparents in part of the family threads and streams is really important because that can really challenge interracial and multiracial family configurations, right? And so getting more clear about how, white socialization is still impacting a family, even if kids are biracial or multiracial, can be profoundly important. But I also want to say, there's many experts out there who can talk really powerfully and are talking powerfully about children being raised in biracial and multiracial families. So Beverly Daniel Tatum is one of them who talks about this. Embrace Race is an amazing organization that is a web-based forum. It's led by an interracial couple. And they convene parents in all kinds of ways, including lots of parents who are in interracial partnerships or have biracial children, to talk about the very acute and specific challenges and gifts that come from being a biracial, multiracial family. And so I would want to encourage folks who are whose kids are biracial or multiracial to really plug into some of those resources, because I'd be speaking beyond my lane if I really tried to lean into that. But the whiteness piece in the white socialization is still important to learn about in the context of those families, because that unique piece around whiteness and the sort of off-kilterness that access to unjust privilege creates for the white folks in the equation definitely still impacts those kids, but not necessarily because they get privilege in the same way. They really may not, right? And so it's more complicated than just saying, embrace your whiteness. And so so I would definitely encourage folks to plug into the many multiracial families that are having these conversations.
Okay, our next question is from Genevieve Oliveira. Do you have any advice on how to navigate raising anti-racist kids when surrounded by family members who may be vocal about colorblindness, have internalized colorism, etc.?
Well, yes, because this is my experience too. Right? I mean, certainly there are white families out there that have existed for longer on a clear anti-racist continuum, that is not the norm in white families. And so in my own experience with this, we and my partner and I have done a couple of things, not all of which have been easy. When our children were very young and we became aware that, more explicitly racist kinds of ways of speaking or, engaging were on the scene, we had some really hard conversations with beloved members of our family and just said, hey, this can't happen if you're going to be alone with our children. This particular thing cannot be said. You need to agree and commit to not saying it, because if you cannot, our young child won't be there without you, because we can't have that happen. And that was really painful. And there was some loss there for a while, but eventually folks circled back around. And even though I don't think we didn't all then agree about everything, there was agreement about, okay, that won't happen whether I get it or not, right? As our kids have gotten older, two things. One is our children have watched us over and over again with other adults say, hey, what you just said made me really uncomfortable because actually that's not really how I think this works, and challenge colorblindness or challenge an assessment of what's going on in terms of, racial justice protesting right now. Our kids have watched us do that. And we have told our children they are allowed to challenge adults when adults say things that are inaccurate, that are racist. And so, for example, we told them before 2016 when they would say, hey, this family member said that, people are breaking the law and that's why this, safety around the border has to happen. We were like, you know what? Actually, people are trying to feed their families and they're fleeing war. And guess what? If you were hungry, we would break the law to feed you. And so that's why people are crossing the border. And to us, it's more important people feed their babies than that they follow a law, right? We gave them this different moral understanding of immigration and borders, right? And we said to them, you're allowed to tell adults that. If they tell you that people are breaking the law, right? You are allowed to say that. And, we don't expect them to do that work on their own, but we have actually found in our family that our children speaking their truths about morality and justice, including when it comes to race in the United States, actually sometimes has had more impact on extended family than like when I do it, because they're just less afraid to just talk about like deep human values, like what it means to them to know that people need to feed their kids. And that's why they're, running across a border, for example. And so I just think our kids need to know that they're allowed to challenge authority and that we will support them when they do it. And we need to also support them when they do it at school too. Like it's okay for them to ask their teachers why they taught them about George Washington, but did not teach them that Washington enslaved people of African descent. Our kids are allowed to challenge their teachers on that, even teachers who are beloved to them. And we need to support them when they do that, because rules and authority of adults, that will be the death of our children's anti-racist sensibilities if we don't teach them that finding their voice with adults is important, but we've got to support them in doing it and not ask them to do it if we aren't also doing it.
Yeah, that's a tremendous call out. Challenging someone doesn't mean that you like them or love them any less.
Right.
That we're having a dialogue. And if you don't have the freedom to have that dialogue,
right,
then we're here.
Sometimes it means you love them more.
Yeah.
Because you're willing to risk the relationship to speak your truth, actually. And I really, more and more as I age, believe that's true, that I've stayed in it in the hard conversations around racism with the people I love the most.
Next question is from Fiz Ahmed. He says, children have time to grow, so there is hope. Is all hope lost for adults? Could you share a story of when you had to shift an adult's mindset on the matter of race?
No, not all hope is lost for adults. I'm sure there's adults for whom all is lost, right? Of course there are, but I cannot believe there is that there is not always the possibility that someone can take in new information in a different way. And so a story, this is about an adult shifting their mindset, and I won't take credit for it, but I will say that, I described at the start of our time, Stephanie, I was raised in a conservative white evangelical home. My family, the adults in my life, always have, been to the right of the right in terms of politics. Mm-hmm. And I started talking about racial justice with my parents very vigorously in my 20s, and it was hard. I mean, it did not make them happy in some occasions. I had some very hard conversations with them, and it impacted our relationship for a long time. And I would feel frustrated, like, why aren't they listening? They're like not seeing what I'm seeing. And, and it was hard, but, and so we journeyed through on there. Well, I will just tell you that in many ways, like my mother, who's this, an almost 80-year-old person, she's incredible in a number of ways. She actually, in the last 3 years, has quite painfully actually migrated out of her church. Last time I went home, she had one of those signs in her yard that said, no matter who you are, what language you speak, you are welcome here. And it was in Arabic and English and I think Spanish. And I was shocked, not because she's not always been a loving person, but like that is kind of like the anti-sign to what I was raised with. And then I also learned that she actually had almost set out and then she didn't, but she did not vote the way she has always voted in 2016. And now she's sending me like, all of these supportive articles about the protests in Kenosha and, Minneapolis. And we still don't agree on a lot of things, but she has really come to understand something differently about what's true in this country and what communities of color's experiences actually are, in ways that in my 20s and 30s, I felt like I was just sort of not seen, not heard. Mm-hmm. And so I just don't think, my mom's literally almost 80, and we're having conversations now in the last 2 years that we have never had. We've had conversations throughout my adult life, but they've never been like this. And so I think it's always worth continuing to talk, continuing to engage, because we just never know what it's going to be that sort of shifts the way someone else or me, I might learn something new. I have learned new things from my mother, right? So we just need to keep having the conversation, regardless, even when it feels like,
All right. Our next question is coming from Kendall Gallantel. She says, I'm white and I want my kids to be raised in a diverse neighborhood, but I don't want to contribute to gentrification. Because then I'm only fueling systemic racism in a way. Any thoughts on that?
That's such a complicated and really important big picture question, because neighborhoods, housing and schooling, I think, are the two of the biggest systems in which, white supremacy and, harmful impact on communities of color are just pervasive and everywhere, and so hard for individuals to figure out how to, in our individual decision making, get traction against, right? And so there's often not great answers, because it's not a better answer necessarily, right, to just then, well, I guess I'll move to the predominantly white suburbs. So what I would say, and this is not a solution to what is just like white racism, systemic white racism has created problems for which there are not sort of one solution that's going to not cause other problems, right? It would be, especially relative to where someone is living or thinking they might want to live, to look around and see what organizations are working on issues of gentrification first, right? Because there are community organizations that are thinking about how do we, support neighborhoods in thriving, and in ways that, may do X for a community without sort of enabling sort of an influx of, white middle to upper middle class income families, and thinking in nuanced ways about gentrification. And so I would just and then alongside that, I would again recommend the organization integratedschools.org, which is an amazing organization thinking about how in segregated school systems, white families can choose and opt into integration by participating in public schools and in their local schools, but again, without then sort of overrunning and negatively impacting schools that have strong people of color leadership and sort of strong climates that are, pro-Black and pro-brown and pro-people of color. So I would just encourage looking around for local organizations that are doing the work on gentrification that are Black and brown led, to help with some of that discernment. That's not an exact answer, but that's the sort of next move I would make.
All right, we'll take one last question from Camille. And they said, as a white parent, I'm struggling with how do we fit into the discussion about race, other minority communities such as Indian, East Asian, etc. Any advice about how to talk this with regards to Black racism? Oh,
okay. I think that So it is really important that as we start to talk about racism and deepen our commitment to anti-racism, that we don't get caught up in also reproducing binaries where it's like white people and Black people only, right? And we've got, Latinx communities and immigrant communities and South Asian communities who absolutely experience, different manifestations of this system that we're all impacted by, let alone Native American communities who we talk about far less frequently than we need to. And so I think that one of the starting places with this, keeping this on our radar and bringing it into our family conversations is somewhat similar to what I think we need to do relative to African American relationships in our, thinking about anti-racism in relation to Black communities. And that is, first, find books, find media, find resources that, share the experience of those communities, right? Both positively and unfettered relative to white racism, right? Just sort of for the joyful wonderfulness of being part of the, South Asian community, for example, as well as resources, kids' resources that do share those stories and bring in an element of some of the racism that diverse communities experience. And that can be a starting point to just, again, get in the mix with our younger children, that there's all kinds of diverse experiences in this, messy, flawed project we call the United States, and that we don't know all of the things, but we certainly want to make sure that we don't render communities invisible, and that any of that sort of those resources we can bring into our children's lives. And then again, sometimes look up and find out, all right, also in our own communities. Like I live in Des Moines, Iowa. There's an amazing Sikh temple in West Des Moines, Iowa, in the suburbs, right? There's actually more diversity in our own communities than sometimes we realize. And so starting to reach out and sort of engage those communities as well can be the work that we do and the decisions we make as we sort of build our own fluency around diverse communities of color and their very diverse experiences in the United States.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harvey, for your time today. This has been just hugely helpful in gaining perspective, even getting practical tips on how to engage, how to do the self-work, and also then how to carry out and go through that journey with our own kids. So I want to thank you for being here with us today. Thank all of you who have tuned in and asked questions, and continue to ask questions within your community circles, within your friend and family circles. It's a conversation that has to be consistent and intentional. And even in the times of fear, we have to do the work. Any last words from you?
No, I just echo that. Even in times of fear, especially in times of fear, we are fighting for the next generation of young people right now, and they deserve our hardest efforts to create a nation that they can all thrive in. So let's do it. We can do it together. Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Have a great day, everyone.